The cabin fell into a silence, so sharp it felt like the air itself had been cut open, the kind of silence that never comes from peace but from shock, and it started with a sentence no one in row 3 of Flight 218 ever expected to hear. "You don't get to sit here like you belong," Jessica Miller said, her voice tight, controlled, almost rehearsed, standing beside the aisle with a coffee tray still in her hand. As if nothing about the moment had already gone wrong, the passenger she was speaking to, Ethan Carter, didn't respond right away. He simply looked down at the dark stain spreading across his white shirt where the hot coffee had landed seconds earlier, not reacting the way people expected him to react. No raised voice, no sudden movement, just stillness, that unsettling kind of stillness that made people pay attention without understanding why. Around them the cabin was mid-flight normality, overhead bins locked, seatbelt lights glowing, a faint hum of engines beneath everything. But inside row 14 something had shifted permanently. Ethan slowly reached for a napkin, wiped his sleeve once, then again, his expression unchanged, almost unreadable, and that only made the tension worse, because silence like that doesn't usually belong to someone who's been wronged. It belongs to someone who is deciding something. Across the aisle a passenger, Olivia Bennett, had already noticed it, her phone lowered just slightly in her lap, camera still running without anyone else realizing it. Her instincts telling her this wasn't just an argument about seating or service. Jessica stepped closer, lowering her voice but sharpening her tone. "I asked you to move to economy earlier and you refused. Now you're causing disruption," she said, though there had been no disruption until she named it. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, almost too calm for the situation. "Check the seat assignment again," he said. Not a challenge, not a threat, just a fact placed gently into the space between them. But Jessica didn't move. Instead, she signaled toward the front of the cabin, where a flight attendant supervisor and a security officer on board were already beginning to pay attention. Ethan's presence did not match what they expected. Plain jacket, simple watch, no visible sign of status, nothing that suggested priority boarding, nothing that explained why he hadn't already complied. And that gap between perception and reality was where assumptions always grew fastest. Olivia leaned slightly into the aisle, whispering under her breath, "He boarded first. I saw it scan green." But her words barely registered over the growing tension. Jessica repeated herself louder. "This time, sir, you need to follow instructions or we will have to escalate this." And the phrase hung there heavier than intended, because escalation always meant control had already shifted. Ethan exhaled once, slow, steady, then reached for the seat pocket in front of him and pulled out his phone, not rushing, not hiding anything, just unlocking it as the cabin around him began to tighten its focus. A few rows back a man turned his head, sensing the shift, the kind of shift that happens right before everything is about to change direction. Ethan didn't look at Jessica when he spoke again. He simply said, "Call the cockpit liaison and tell them to verify Carter authorization." And for the first time Jessica hesitated, not because she understood, but because she didn't. And in that hesitation, something larger than the argument quietly began to wake up. The hesitation in Jessica Miller's expression lasted only a moment. But in that moment the atmosphere inside the cabin changed again. Not louder, not more chaotic, but more focused, as if the entire space had begun to listen in a different way. She adjusted her posture and looked toward the front of the aircraft, pressing her headset as she spoke into the internal line, her voice now carrying the formal tone of procedure rather than confrontation. "Cockpit liaison, we need verification on a passenger claiming priority authorization under the Carter registry," she said. And for a brief second the only sound that followed was the steady vibration of the aircraft cruising above 30,000 feet. Ethan Carter remained seated, his hands resting calmly in front of him, his phone still unlocked, screen glowing softly as if waiting for confirmation rather than permission. Olivia Bennett in the adjacent row had now shifted fully into observation, her phone angled slightly higher, capturing without interruption, not as a statement, but as instinct. Because something about the way this was unfolding no longer felt like a routine misunderstanding. It felt like a system testing its own boundaries. A few seats ahead, another flight attendant, Daniel Brooks, approached slowly, his expression controlled but alert. "Sir, we are verifying your information now," he said carefully, not accusatory but cautious. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging without resistance. "That is expected," he replied, his voice steady and measured, which only deepened the uncertainty around him, because calmness in moments like this often unsettled people more than anger ever could. Jessica returned her attention to him, her confidence slightly recalibrated but still firm. "Until verification is complete, we need you to remain seated and comply with crew instructions," she stated, and Ethan looked up at her for the first time since the incident began, not with defiance, but with a quiet awareness that made the words feel heavier than intended. "I am complying," he said simply, then added, "You are waiting for confirmation that already exists," and the distinction between those two statements spread through the nearby rows like a ripple. Olivia leaned closer to the aisle again, whispering just loud enough for the passenger next to her to hear. "This is not random. I saw his name scanned first class at boarding." And that detail, small and unverified as it was, began to change the way people were interpreting what they were seeing. A few passengers now exchanged glances, phones subtly shifting from idle use to recording mode. Daniel Brooks stepped back slightly, speaking again into his headset. "We are awaiting direct clearance from the cockpit system," he said, and for the first time there was a hint of uncertainty in his otherwise controlled demeanor. Ethan finally unlocked his phone fully and placed it on the tray table in front of him, screen facing upward, not displaying urgency, not displaying fear, just an open interface waiting for response. "This aircraft is operating under Carter Aviation Group oversight for this route," he said calmly. "The verification will complete itself." And although no one immediately responded, the phrase lingered in the air longer than expected, because now the situation was no longer about seating or misunderstanding. It was about identity intersecting with authority at 30,000 feet above ground. And in that suspended space, every second of silence felt like a decision being made somewhere out of sight. The cabin remained suspended in a tense quiet that felt heavier with every passing second, not because anyone had stopped moving, but because every movement now carried meaning. Every glance, every breath, every shift in a seat seemed to reflect an unfolding system no one could fully see yet. Jessica Miller stood near the aisle, still listening through her headset, her earlier certainty beginning to give way to something more cautious as the response from the cockpit liaison continued to delay. Daniel Brooks remained positioned a few rows forward, eyes scanning the passengers, and then briefly returning to Ethan Carter, as if recalibrating what category of problem this actually was. Ethan himself had not changed his posture, still seated, still composed, hands resting naturally near his phone, which remained on the tray table, its screen glowing softly with an open verification interface that no one around him seemed able to interpret with confidence. Olivia Bennett had now fully committed to recording, her phone steady, her breathing controlled, capturing not just Ethan but the reactions forming around him, because the story was no longer in one person's behavior, it was in the system reacting to him. Jessica finally spoke again into her headset. "Cockpit liaison confirms partial match in executive registry, escalating to corporate verification channel." And those words shifted the energy in the cabin instantly, because partial match meant uncertainty, and uncertainty in this environment always meant authority was being rerouted. Daniel stepped slightly closer to Jessica, lowering his voice as he asked for clarification, and she responded with a controlled but tighter tone. "We are being instructed to hold position until direct corporate authorization is received." And that phrase alone caused several passengers to look at each other, sensing that the structure of control on board was no longer entirely in the hands of the crew. Ethan turned his head slightly toward the aisle, his voice still calm. "That authorization will arrive within moments," he said, not as prediction but as confirmation of process, and then added, "You are currently interacting with a live executive clearance protocol," which caused a subtle shift in Daniel's expression as he processed whether this was confidence or verified truth. Olivia lowered her phone for a second and whispered to the passenger next to her, "He is not reacting like someone who is unsure." And that observation began to spread quietly through nearby seats as people started reassessing what they thought they were witnessing. Jessica adjusted her stance again, now less confrontational and more procedural, but still under pressure from the unknown. "Sir, until we receive full confirmation, "We need you to remain where you are," she repeated, and Ethan gave a slight nod, accepting the instruction without resistance, which paradoxically made him seem even less like someone under suspicion and more like someone following a process already familiar to him. A few rows ahead, the intercom system clicked softly, not announcing anything yet, just preparing, and that sound alone caused several passengers to sit straighter, because they sensed an announcement was coming. Daniel looked briefly toward the cockpit door, then back at Ethan, and for the first time his tone softened slightly. "We are waiting on final confirmation now," he said, as if acknowledging that control was no longer fully in his hands. Ethan finally glanced down at his phone again, then spoke one last line that settled differently in the space than anything before it. "Then you will understand exactly who is on this aircraft." And the words did not escalate the situation, but instead deepened the silence, making it clear that whatever was about to arrive was not a negotiation, but a resolution already in motion. The pressure inside the cabin had shifted into something almost invisible, no longer driven by confrontation alone, but by anticipation, as if every passenger had begun to sense that a decision was approaching from somewhere beyond their immediate view. Jessica Miller stood motionless near the aisle, her headset still connected, listening to a channel that had grown increasingly quiet except for brief confirmations that offered more structure than clarity. Daniel Brooks remained attentive near the front section, his posture now less assertive and more observant, as though the role he thought he held had subtly changed without announcement. Ethan Carter continued to sit in the same position, unchanged in posture or expression, his phone still resting on the tray table with the screen active, displaying a verification state that no one around him seemed willing to question directly anymore. Olivia Bennett had now fully shifted from observer to documenter, her phone steady and focused, capturing not just Ethan but the reactions of those around him as uncertainty spread in controlled waves through the cabin. A soft notification sound came through Jessica's headset, and she paused for a fraction of a second before speaking, her tone noticeably different from earlier. "Corporate verification channel has been engaged," she said, and the phrasing alone caused Daniel to straighten slightly. Because engagement meant escalation had already moved beyond the aircraft, Ethan did not react immediately. Instead, he looked forward calmly, as if confirming that the process had reached the expected stage, and then he spoke quietly. "You are now connected to the final authorization layer," he said, and the simplicity of his statement made it difficult for anyone to dismiss as speculation. Olivia lowered her phone briefly and glanced toward the cabin crew, noticing the subtle shift in their behavior. No longer directive, now reactive. Jessica adjusted her headset again as another message came through, her expression tightening just slightly as she listened. Then she said, "We have live confirmation request from Executive Operations," and at that moment, the intercom system in the cabin activated with a soft tone that immediately drew attention from every direction. Passengers who had been watching casually now fully turned their focus forward. Sensing that something formal and irreversible was about to occur, Daniel stepped closer to Jessica, but did not interrupt, as if waiting for a threshold to be crossed before speaking again. Ethan finally picked up his phone from the tray table, not hurried, not defensive, simply deliberate, and as he held it in his hand, the cabin intercom crackled once more, followed by a calm, controlled voice identifying itself as Corporate Operations Control. The message was brief, structured, and authoritative, acknowledging a live verification of identity under executive clearance protocol. And as those words settled into the cabin, the atmosphere changed in a way that was no longer about suspicion or debate, but about recognition of authority arriving from outside the immediate space. Jessica lowered her headset slightly, her role now clearly subordinate to what was being confirmed above them. Daniel's expression shifted into something closer to realization than confusion, and Ethan Carter remained still for a moment longer before placing his phone back on the tray table, the screen now showing confirmation status rather than pending verification. And in that quiet transition, the cabin understood without anyone needing to say it directly that the situation they had been interpreting as conflict was in fact a system response already concluding its own evaluation. The cabin no longer felt like a space of uncertainty, but like a place where something irreversible had already been set in motion, as if the air itself had accepted a new reality before anyone fully processed it. Jessica Miller stood with her headset still on, but no longer speaking, listening instead to the final layers of confirmation flowing through channels that now carried unmistakable authority. Daniel Brooks remained near the front section, his posture unchanged, yet his attention fully sharpened, no longer trying to interpret what was happening, but recognizing that interpretation was no longer required. Ethan Carter sat in the same position as before, but the atmosphere around him had shifted in a way that made his stillness feel no longer passive but definitive. His phone now resting on the tray table, displaying a finalized verification state that no one needed to announce out loud for it to be understood. Olivia Bennett kept her camera steady, her breathing controlled, aware that what she was recording was no longer speculation but resolution unfolding in real time. A soft tone came through the cabin intercom again, followed by a composed voice confirming executive authorization and identity validation under active corporate oversight. And as the message concluded, a subtle but undeniable change moved through the cabin crew. Jessica slowly lowered her headset, her eyes shifting briefly toward Ethan with a new understanding replacing earlier certainty. Daniel stepped slightly closer, but did not speak immediately, as if acknowledging that the role he had been operating under had just been redefined without warning. Ethan finally picked up his phone and locked the screen with a calm, deliberate motion, then placed it back on the tray table. And in that simple action, there was a sense of closure that no instruction or announcement could have created. Olivia lowered her phone slightly, no longer needing to adjust framing because the moment had become stable rather than unfolding. Passengers who had been quietly watching now began to settle back into their seats, not out of dismissal, but out of recognition that the situation they had been mentally preparing for had already concluded in a direction they had not fully understood at the start. Jessica removed her headset completely and spoke in a softer tone to Daniel, acknowledging that corporate verification had been completed and that no further action was required. Daniel nodded once, his expression shifting into professional reset rather than intervention, and Ethan remained seated for a brief moment longer, not as a statement of dominance, but as confirmation that the process around him had finished its cycle, before finally leaning back slightly as the cabin returned to its normal flight rhythm, though nothing about the perception of those who had witnessed it would remain the same again. The cabin had returned to its steady rhythm of flight, yet nothing about the human atmosphere inside it had fully returned to what it was before, because once authority is questioned and then confirmed, the space between those two moments never truly disappears from memory. Jessica Miller had removed her headset completely now, holding it loosely in her hand as she stood near the forward section, her posture no longer defensive but reflective, as if recalibrating everything she had assumed. Only minutes earlier, Daniel Brooks had resumed his position near the front cabin wall, speaking quietly with another crew member in a tone that suggested procedural closure rather than escalation. Yet his eyes still drifted briefly toward Ethan Carter, not with suspicion anymore, but with the awareness of someone who had misread a situation and now understood the correction. Ethan remained seated, calm and composed, his presence no longer drawing tension, but leaving behind a quiet acknowledgement that the earlier uncertainty had been resolved through channels no one in the cabin could directly see. His phone lay on the tray table now locked and inactive, as if the entire sequence of verification had never needed physical proof in the first place. Olivia Bennett finally lowered her camera fully, no longer recording, her expression shifting from focus to contemplation, as she looked around the cabin and noticed how quickly people were returning to normal behavior while still holding onto the memory of what had just occurred. A flight attendant moved through the aisle with measured steps, offering small gestures of service that felt slightly delayed in their return to routine, as though the cabin itself was catching up to a reality that had already been decided. Jessica finally spoke in a low tone to Daniel, confirming that corporate operations had closed the active verification loop and that no further intervention was required. Daniel nodded and adjusted his stance, signaling to the crew that standard service flow could resume. Yet even as announcements of normalcy quietly returned, the psychological shift remained visible in the subtle way passengers avoided premature judgments, in the way conversations stayed softer, and in the way several eyes still occasionally drifted toward Ethan, not out of suspicion anymore, but out of recognition that what they had witnessed was not a confrontation that ended in victory or defeat, but a system revealing itself in real time and then silently stepping back once its confirmation was complete. The cabin had settled into a fragile version of normality, the kind that only exists after something significant has already changed shape in people's minds, where the external environment continues as scheduled, but the internal understanding of those who witnessed the moment has permanently shifted. Flight attendants moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency, restoring service patterns that felt familiar yet slightly delayed, as if every action now required a second of internal recalibration before execution. Jessica Miller stood near the forward section of the cabin, speaking quietly with Daniel Brooks, her tone no longer carrying urgency, but instead a measured professionalism that reflected the completion of protocol rather than its activation. Daniel responded with small nods, occasionally glancing toward Ethan Carter without the earlier uncertainty, now replaced by a kind of respectful acknowledgement that came after confirmation rather than assumption. Ethan remained seated in the same position he had held throughout the entire sequence, composed and still, no longer the center of tension, but still quietly holding the residual attention of those who had witnessed the transition from doubt to verification. His phone remained on the tray table, screen dark now, as if the entire system that had briefly activated around him had fully reseated back into silence. Olivia Bennett finally lowered her phone completely and leaned back into her seat, her expression no longer focused on recording but on processing what she had observed, occasionally glancing around the cabin at other passengers who were also beginning to settle into a shared but unspoken understanding that something about their perception of authority had just been recalibrated. A few seats ahead, a passenger quietly mentioned to another that the verification had come through corporate channels, not as rumor, but as fact, repeated with the caution of someone who had just learned not to rely on surface judgment. Jessica adjusted her uniform slightly and spoke one final time to Daniel, confirming that all procedures had been officially closed and that cabin operations were to continue as standard. Daniel acknowledged this with a brief response and stepped back toward his assigned area, signaling to the rest of the crew that the situation had fully transitioned out of active management. Ethan finally shifted slightly in his seat, not in reaction to anything ongoing, but as a natural return to comfort. And for the first time since the incident began, no one around him attempted to interpret his behavior as anything other than ordinary. Yet even in this return to normalcy, there remained an invisible trace of what had occurred, carried not in announcements or actions, but in the subtle awareness of those who now understood that identity in that cabin had not been a matter of appearance or assumption, but something that revealed itself only when the system itself was required to respond, and then disappeared just as quietly once confirmation was complete. The cabin had fully returned to its standard cruising rhythm, yet the atmosphere inside carried a residual weight that no announcement could erase, as if every passenger had silently agreed that what had happened earlier would remain part of the flight, even if it was no longer part of the operational moment. Flight attendants moved through the aisle with calm precision, offering refreshments and adjusting seat service as though restoring normality could also restore emotional balance. But small details revealed that something had permanently shifted in perception. Conversations were quieter, eye contact lasted slightly longer, and judgments seemed more measured than before. Jessica Miller walked slowly toward the forward galley area, now fully removed from any urgency, her headset resting idle at her side as she exchanged a brief and professional acknowledgement with Daniel Brooks, both of them operating now in post-incident protocol rather than active response. Daniel gave a subtle nod as he reviewed final internal notes on a handheld device, confirming that all corporate communications had been logged and that no further escalation channels were active. Ethan Carter remained seated in the same position he had held throughout the journey, his posture relaxed in a way that contrasted with the intensity that had surrounded him earlier, his phone now placed away and no longer part of the visible environment, as if it had completed its role in the sequence of events. Olivia Bennett sat back in her seat, no longer recording, but occasionally looking around the cabin with a thoughtful expression, as though mentally replaying the difference between perception and confirmation. A few rows ahead, passengers were now engaging in quiet conversation about what they had witnessed, not in speculation but in reflection. acknowledging how quickly assumptions had formed, and how quickly they had been corrected once formal verification had arrived. Jessica paused briefly near Daniel and spoke in a low tone, confirming that all corporate audit notes had been finalized and that the flight could continue without restriction or additional review. Daniel acknowledged this and secured his device, signaling the full transition from incident handling to routine operation. Meanwhile, subtle corporate system updates were being reflected through crew devices, visible only in brief notifications that confirmed closure of the verification event and completion of internal review tagging, none of which required announcement, but all of which reinforced that the situation had been fully resolved at an institutional level. Ethan adjusted his seating slightly, now completely integrated back into the normal environment of the cabin, no longer positioned as a subject of attention, but simply as a passenger continuing his journey. Yet even as the flight stabilized, the psychological imprint remained in the behavior of those around him, in the reduced certainty of quick assumptions, in the increased attention to detail before drawing conclusions, and in the quiet understanding that authority in that space had not been what it initially appeared to be, but something that only became visible when systems were triggered and then silently withdrawn once validation was complete, leaving behind a cabin that looked unchanged but felt fundamentally different to everyone who had witnessed the sequence unfold. The cabin continued its steady forward motion through the sky, now fully stabilized in both operation and perception, as if the aircraft itself had moved past the moment of disruption and into a phase of quiet continuity. Yet within the cabin, the experience lingered in a way that no technical resolution could erase. Flight attendants moved with practiced normalcy, but even their routines carried a subtle awareness that something significant had occurred and been resolved above the level of immediate observation. Jessica Miller stood near the forward service area, no longer wearing her headset, her posture relaxed but reflective, exchanging a final professional nod with Daniel Brooks, as they both confirmed through their internal systems that all corporate verification protocols had been fully closed and logged. Daniel reviewed his final notes once more before securing his device, signaling the end of any active oversight related to the earlier sequence of events. Yet, even as the administrative process concluded, neither of them seemed eager to dismiss the broader implications of what had unfolded. Because some incidents reveal more than procedural weaknesses, they reveal how perception itself can influence behavior before facts have the opportunity to speak. Ethan Carter remained seated in the same position he had occupied throughout the flight, calm and composed, no longer the subject of attention, but simply part of the cabin's restored order, his presence now indistinguishable from any other passenger in terms of outward significance. And that normality carried a quiet irony understood by many aboard. Only hours earlier, assumptions had transformed him into the center of scrutiny. Now those same assumptions had vanished, replaced by the uncomfortable recognition that nothing about him had changed at all. Olivia Bennett sat back fully in her seat, her phone no longer in use, her gaze drifting across the cabin with a quiet understanding that what she had witnessed was not a moment of spectacle, but a demonstration of how quickly perception could be overturned when systems of verification activated beyond human assumption. And as she watched passengers settle back into their routines, she found herself reflecting on how many judgments people make every day without realizing how incomplete the information behind them truly is. Passengers who had earlier been attentive or uncertain now resumed normal in-flight behavior, conversations returning at a low volume, seat adjustments, and quiet movements that signaled the restoration of routine travel conditions. But there remained a noticeable difference in the atmosphere. The cabin no longer felt divided between observers and participants. Instead, there was a shared awareness that everyone present had witnessed a lesson unfold in real time. A businessman near the rear cabin closed his laptop, but remained thoughtful. A woman across the aisle stared briefly out the window before returning to her book, though she had not turned a page in several minutes. Even those who had never spoken during the incident carried away their own private conclusions. Jessica took a final look toward the aisle before returning to her station, her expression composed, as if mentally closing a chapter that had unfolded and resolved within a single flight segment. She had followed procedures. Others had followed procedures as well. Yet the outcome had demonstrated that procedures alone could never replace judgment, empathy, and patience. Daniel gave a final procedural confirmation over his internal channel, marking the incident as fully resolved with no further action required. And the notification quietly disappeared into the larger stream of corporate records where countless operational events were stored each day. Yet unlike most reports, this one would likely be remembered long after the documentation itself was archived. Not because of who Ethan Carter was, but because of what the situation revealed about everyone around him. As the aircraft continued its steady journey, the cabin settled into a collective state of normality that was no longer naive but informed, shaped by the understanding that what had appeared to be conflict had already been governed by an unseen structure of authority that only revealed itself when required, leaving behind a quiet but lasting awareness among those present that assumptions made in moments of uncertainty can be rewritten instantly by the systems that operate beyond immediate perception. Beyond the windows, darkness stretched across the horizon while distant city lights appeared as scattered constellations far below. Inside the cabin, the engines maintained their steady rhythm, a constant reminder that the journey continued regardless of the events that had taken place. And Ethan Carter, now simply another passenger among many, continued his journey in silence as the flight moved forward without interruption, carrying with it not only its travelers, but also the memory of a moment when identity, perception, and verification briefly intersected before returning to order. Yet for many aboard, the most enduring lesson was not about corporate authority or hidden influence. It was the realization that the truth about a person often exists long before anyone takes the time to verify it, and that genuine fairness begins when people choose to see humanity first and assumptions second.